Right, thanks, Tom. There's quite a lot of feedback to give you. I've got 6 slides in total, so there's a huge amount of material coming up from the tables already, which suggests you've been getting to grips with this on a major scale. So I have 6 slides. I'm going to start with 2 slides that are on the topic of arguments against reform, and I'll just, as usual, quickly talk you through them. So, arguments against reform, the practicalities of how you would do it, and the problems of implementing it if you were to try this route. So clearly it's just it's such a major undertaking. There's the resource issue. That's obviously an obvious one that came up quite a bit. The resource issue, how could we afford it if we were to go down this route? People would take advantage. It could create an entitlement culture in the country. And sort of somewhat related, an over-reliance on social rights could be damaging for the country. And then this last bullet point here, we'll come back at the very end to, we need state reform, not constitutional reform. So constitutional reform, the argument here, is not the way to go. It would be better to deal with this through secondary legislation, through legislation in the Dáil, in other words. A second slide on arguments against reform. It would shift the balance of power between courts and the judgment. There are a couple of points here about whether this is the right way to go in terms of strengthening the role of the judiciary. Is this the right thing for a democracy like ours? So this should not be the role of judges, was the argument that came up from at least one table. Another table says they were wary of giving too much power to judges. It could reduce or in some way endanger representative democracy as we know it. Then possible problems of clarifying, defining the rights. That's a bit like a bullet point that came up earlier on. There's a bit of overlap here we couldn't avoid. And then finally, some problems just can't be solved. We're doing our best already as a country. So they're the arguments that came out most strongly from all of you on against reform. Arguments for reform. There's just one slide and then a couple that follow from this one slide. It would be a big stick to beat the government with. It would help to change the culture of public administration in this country. Quite a strongly held view from at least one table. More equal society would ultimately be more prosperous. We should be updating the Constitution just to reflect the fact that society has changed, and so we should update the Constitution to reflect that. We should improve public access to services and rights. We should, this is specifically on culture, we should recognise the increasing diversity of culture in Ireland. And then finally, the rights of Irish citizens to decide on what rights should be inserted into the Constitution. So we as citizens have a right to say what we want inserted by way of economic, social and cultural rights. So having set out the arguments in favour, then there was a set of points that came together in terms of possible approaches if we were to go down the road of constitutional reform. These are some ideas that are beginning to emerge from some tables at least. A very prominent idea that came up from quite a number of tables was that while rights are important, enforceability is the key issue. So it's the how rather than the what, I suppose. Following on from that, we need an independent body to ensure these rights, such as giving the role to the courts or some other body. Perhaps we should use the United Nations Convention as a template, and I believe we're putting together some material by way of example of what that's about. That the existing structures for redress should be improved so that way we can avoid the problem that citizens face of having to go through expensive and time-consuming court action. And then this final point, broad guiding principles are best rather than specifics. There was at least one table that said, look, we can't get down to specifics. It's better just to sort of talk about the broad principles and let others deal with the specifics. That's what one table said, but then a whole bunch of other tables actually said, no, we do have specifics in mind, and here they are. And the most prominent specific point that came out from, I think, most of the tables was we should strengthen Article 45 in some way or another, expand Article 45. There were a number of tables that seemed to have interest in doing what we could to protect the vulnerable in society, and various ways of defining that were things like that everyone should have certain minimum rights, such as a right to a roof over your head, healthcare and pension, special provision for those with special needs, whether mental or physical. It should be an offence that certain groups are allowed to fall below a certain level of protection in society. And then actually, there were quite a few tables talking about the principle of human dignity, that could be enshrined in the Constitution. So there are all the points that seem to come up in the area of constitutional reform and how it might happen and what it might look like. And a final slide was, we'd asked the tables to consider the question, okay, what if you were to look at the possibility of reform without amending the Constitution? What would you consider? And these were the points that came up most prominently. So we should deal with the costs of court access. Better information and education of public about existing rights, because there's so much ignorance out there clearly about what rights we already have as citizens. We should strengthen the role of the Ombudsman Office and other relevant watchdogs in the area. We as a convention perhaps might propose specific areas for new legislation. That gets back to that earlier point about going down the legislation road rather than the constitution road. We could incorporate EU and international law without delay. And then back to some old questions, much loved here. Reform the Dáil to give more power to the opposition in this area. Local government reform, some interesting points about local government reform. Let's focus on local government and see how we could strengthen local government in issues like housing offices, for example, to try and deal with certain areas that could be done best locally. So they're the main slides.
Okay, David, thank you. I mean, that presents a pretty wide canvas, and I think our challenge is going to be to refine things down as we head towards a ballot paper in the later part of the afternoon. But we have time now to open the floor. We also have access still to Liam and Aoife. Actually, would you maybe just out of practicality come up to the stage now in case there are questions addressed to you, and you might as well be up here to take them. Okay, who would like to comment on what David has said? Yeah, Charlie, firstly. Thank you.
On a point of order.
Yeah.
Maybe just on a point of order. Having regard to the fact that this has proved quite complex, and it is quite detailed, and you know, I felt early this morning, with the greatest of respect to our guests, but I did feel perhaps, you know, that I was at a seminar for academic constitutional lawyers. And in the course of the morning, you know, that sense dissipated. But I do think we shouldn't underestimate the complexities. So I'm wondering, would it be possible, without causing any undue burden on the Secretariat, but if each table could have a copy of the arguments for and the arguments against, just with, say, 2 sheets for each table, because that will form our view when we come to discuss it. I merely ask that.
I mean, that whole presentation, I think, is probably what is most relevant. And I think your point that these are complex, weighty matters is indeed self-evidently true. Other comments? Yeah, Andrew here. Yeah, wait for the mic.
Andrew Kinsella is my name. I just to make one comment just to how we actually got here, Chairman. You know, I'm very conscious of the fact that we, in the AOB section of the convention, we voted and we got down to 2 particular points, of which this is one. And my sense of it is that were we to do nothing on this point, and we will be voting eventually tomorrow, I guess, that we will have missed the opportunity. So I'm really just reminding the meeting of how we got to this point, and that complex and all as it is, and the barriers which may exist, that because of that, to do nothing, I think, would be a missed opportunity. And I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that there were many other, including the environment, subject matters which we chose not to discuss at this meeting. And just to remember how we actually got to this point.
Yeah, okay, it's a fair point, but in fact I don't think anyone is suggesting that we have to frame a ballot paper, and we'll have to come up with some conclusions from the weekend, clearly, yeah. David, first. Could we have the mic over here, please? Sorry, David Cullinan.
Thank you. Just actually a very quick question for the 2 panellists, and just might be the best way to put this rather than just a contribution from the floor. Listening to some of the arguments against, which were up on the slides, I think it's important that we work on the basis of facts, and we understand then what exactly would happen if we were to enshrine in the Constitution economic, social and cultural rights, because 2 of the main arguments against are that it would give too much power to the courts and potentially could be anti-democratic. Where in reality, and it was said from the earlier presentations, that it is the people that will decide what goes into the Constitution by way of a referendum. So we as a people would decide what rights we would want conferred on citizens, and in a sense that is democratic, because it's the citizens would decide. And at the end of the day, the courts are only there to adjudicate on what is in the Constitution, and we saw that with the Supreme Court judgment in relation to the X case, where they interpreted the wording of a referendum. Now, it took 20 odd years before the legislator eventually implemented that, but it was still back to the legislator. So that's the question I have to two panellists. Even if we were to put this into the Constitution and there were court challenges, is it the case that the courts can only interpret what's in the Constitution and then refer it back to the legislator to act on that court judgment rather than, you know, be overly prescriptive, I suppose?
Okay, we'll take that in a moment. I want to take a couple of questions. I saw Catherine first, actually, and then Katrina. Could I just say now that as we've half an hour left, anyone who's standing up, I want them to be quite brief and to the point. Yeah.
Yeah, our current constitution, when it was framed, some of the provisions in it are very much of their time. And I think it's very important when we're thinking of this that we don't think of just today, but you know, the longevity of the kind of things that we might include in the Constitution about the ideal type of society we want, and can we use the Constitution to state that? Okay. So I think it's important we just don't think of the economic times that we're in terms of a limitation. I think we should think beyond that.
Okay, thanks. Katrina, and then Jim. I'm taking people in the order that I see them, so yeah.
I actually think it's quite simple what we're being asked to do here today. And yes, the legalities of everything might be complex, but our job, I think, I would argue, is that we have to ensure we create the best Ireland that we can for all our citizens. And so it's very simple, really. Do we believe somebody shouldn't be homeless and should have a roof over their head? Do we believe somebody should have access to a job? Do we believe somebody should have right to education and also the supports inbuilt there? And I would just say, and I know you want people to be brief, the question of resources can be two ways. If we don't enshrine those rights, and if people don't get good education or don't have a house, we end up paying the other way because they won't have a job, you'll be paying social welfare. Some may end up in our legal system. And I know when I was Minister of Education, I welcomed equality and rights-based legislation and the strongest equality. So this, I don't think this should be viewed as the executive don't want to see strong legislation or protections in place. So I think it's very simple that we have to discuss here today.
Thank you. Jim?
Well, people have said this is a very complex issue, but I don't really think it is. Because, I mean, the 18th century was about the Enlightenment, and someone mentioned here property rights. It was about legal rights. And the 19th century then moved on to political rights, which was codified as who got the vote. And eventually that was sorted. And then, as a direct consequence, we're now moving on to social rights. And we have some legal social rights in the Constitution, such as the right to primary education. And really the discussion is quite simply how far we want to go in that direction. Mm-hmm. And a doctrinaire Marxist there, like David Cullinan, will say we can have perfection and we can move right through the whole spectrum and have total equality. And then maybe someone like Karl Popper would say that you can't make things perfect, but you can make things better. And I'd be sort of in that mold. With due regard to Marx, who is a good.
All right.
What?
Okay, sorry, Jim. Yeah.
Only pulling your leg, David. Anyway.
All right. Okay.
But the thing is, that's where I would see it. How far we want to go in this direction, and how far we want to codify social rights.
All right. Thank you very much. Let's go to the panel. Which of you would like to comment on this?
I'll comment.
You comment again. Pick the issues that you want to respond to.
Okay, I'm going to just comment to a few because I think a few are things about opinion, and I want to try to avoid that. The first thing I'd point out is that I do think we need to remember, and it's not surprising because often when we talk about economic, social and cultural rights, the discussion does focus on courts, blah, blah, blah. I do think we need to remember that the fundamental purpose and the the fundamental purpose of any right under the Constitution is to set out a specific framework of action for government, right, and to steer, provide guidance and a framework for the elected branches of government. The courts only come in if there's been a problem. The court's role is reactive. So in fact, I think it is helpful to think as well about ESCR as not just being about the courts doing everything, but actually thinking about what might this mean for democratic for the elected branches of government in terms of policy making and law making, because that's what's important in terms of giving effect to these rights. The other thing is dealing with the argument that such rights would be anti-democratic. At the moment, the courts make all sorts of decisions around tax, around property rights that have major implications for resources or government policy, etc. So I think if we, on the one hand, absolutely we can be uncomfortable with judicial review as being undemocratic, but we need to acknowledge that we already have undemocratic judicial review in different areas of law. That doesn't mean we necessarily want it with the ESCR, but it's just to be aware that this isn't something that's only associated. There is this legitimacy and democracy issue, across the board with judicial review. You'd said about courts directing budgets. I mean, different courts will do different things, but I mean, I think one needs to be realistic. In every court, when you look at practice with ESCR and you see courts that have similar backgrounds and come from liberal constitutional democracies in the sense that our Irish constitutional framework is one of liberal democracy, it is extremely unusual to see a court going off, and I'm talking now from practice, going off and directing budgets or setting out policies that the state may do. A huge amount of courts dealing with ESCR is actually saying the state has a policy that it said it's going to give effect to, it hasn't given effect to, and then saying, but actually you need to give effect to this because you also have this constitutional obligation, right? So just to be clear that it doesn't mean the courts become terribly proactive. Again, the courts are reactive. And given the nature of our Irish courts, who have been historically very reluctant for all sorts of sensible reasons to get involved in discussions around resources and interfering with the decisions of elected branches of government, I think it's unrealistic to assume that by simply putting in a new set of rights or a new kind of right that suddenly we're going to see this flood of cases from an activist judiciary that's never been that way before.
All right. Liam, do you have a comment?
Very, very briefly. Constitutional is a document that can be both idealistic, legalistic and political. So if you do decide to make a recommendation on ESC rights inclusion, then other rights are already protected. I think it is important to recognise, as Jim does, the kind of how rights have developed. I mean, property rights developed into political rights, developed into legal rights, developed into what are now social rights. We do have some social rights already protected, leading into the argument, which I have to say, it comes up all the time about courts suddenly becoming, these monsters who are going around directing how resources are to be spent. Courts adjudicating all kinds of matters which have an impact on resources, both private and public resources. Why suddenly, when it comes to ESC rights, can we not trust the courts, but we can somehow trust them in deciding all these other very difficult matters at all other times? I have to say, I'm not fully convinced about the argument that, we don't have an activist and we've never had an overly activist judiciary in Ireland. So I don't see how the whole courts given too much power. I don't see that argument as being that issue as being overly problematic. Nor a country that I can think of which has some socioeconomic rights protection. There hasn't been a juristocracy established.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that those did cover most of the issues that were raised. Any further comments? Yeah. These two, and yeah. David and Robert.
Just a discussion which arose at our table, which didn't make it to the screen, is there was a lot of talk about the cultural aspect of this and about defending Irish culture and maintaining Irish culture. And I kind of felt that was a reason to oppose reform, because culture is such a fluid concept and it's so hard to define, say, Irish culture, and it's such a personal concept as well. We'd all have slightly different interpretations of what Irish culture means to you. So I felt that was actually a reason to oppose reform, and I just thought I should mention that as it wasn't on the screen.
Okay, thank you. Robert.
Thank you. Just can I say very strongly, I would like to see a provision in the Constitution which guarantees the right to shelter or housing to people, because it is such a fundamental need for all of us. And I would hope that when we come to vote, that will be one of the issues that we will vote on. And while I'd be uninclined to be to down in many cases in terms of social and economic issues, I don't think it should be just seen as general guidance for the Oireachtas. I think it should be seen as a fundamental right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll take one or two more comments if people want to make them. Yeah, John, please.
John, I suppose can we afford it? There's 4.5 plus million people in this country, the working adults, the middle class, the working class. Can they currently afford what is ahead of them at the moment, next year with property taxes, water, etc.? Can we afford to pay for this excellent physical health, excellent free care, education, etc.? I just throw that caution in there. Can we actually afford this wish list? Thank you.
Thank you. It was mentioned on the slide, the affordability of more substantial underpinning of rights in constitutions. Okay, why don't we, I mean, again, reflections from okay, we'll take you and then Edin, and then we'll go to the panel. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. One of the things that I asked for before the break was to get a copy of some of the sections from the International Covenant itself on economic and social rights. And just in response to what John said there about resources, I think, perhaps one of the issues that we're talking about here is enshrining principles. And I think some of the wording of the Covenant itself is quite helpful in this manner, because it basically says that every state that's party to the Covenant undertakes to take steps. But what it does say is it says to the maximum of its available resources with a view to achieving progressively the full realisation of rights. So, I think what is clear there in the Covenant itself, which kind of was discussed earlier this morning, is that nobody is turning around and saying, everybody has a right to come up and demand a 5-bedroom detached house. It is about gradual and progressive realisation. But I think it's also perhaps more important to have these rights at a time of recession, because it's about making choices and it's about protecting the most vulnerable. And in my opinion, the part of the reason we need to have these type of protections in the Constitution is, in fact, to make it clear to government that we prioritise the most vulnerable. And I think that is a really important thing to do in a document that is actually the most important document in this country, the Constitution.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's go again back to take.
I'm going to go back to comparative examples. And every single country that has had a discussion about whether or not to include an ESCR has dealt with the issue of resources for obvious reasons, right? Absolutely. What's noticeable is that countries that have dealt with the issue of resources have still moved forward in enshrining economic, social and cultural rights. But in doing so, they have, as has just been said, I think by Aideen, just there, they have done so by making it clear that the government isn't expected the country isn't expected to bankrupt itself, meeting a load of random individual requests related to these rights, but that in fact the state has to do what it can manage, what it can do within the resources available to it. So it's not that it's a case of the state having to do something it can't afford, it's doing as much as it can afford to do, if that makes sense. That is the approach, the kind of predominant model that you see in comparative experience. But it's not that I'm at all belittling the resources argument, I'm simply saying that there are places we can look for information, for examples, and one of them is the language of the Covenant that was mentioned just there.
The only other issue I think DFA has dealt with the issue of resource allocation and resources is the issue of culture that was raised by David. I suppose, and it might have been my lack of clear explanation as to what exactly is protected by the right to culture. It doesn't mandate or enforce on any individual in obligation to practice some cultural cultural event or to embrace some cultural way of life. It simply says that the state may have an obligation may have an obligation to support cultural rights, which includes basically inclusion, just including people. That's all it is. It's not forcing anybody to do anything that they do not want. It's just basically, I suppose, an inclusion right, that you will be included in the discussion, in society, in technological, scientific advances rather, and also that your right to use whatever language you want to use, that's not restricted, and that your issues to do with ethnicity are also respected. So that's all that cultural rights will generally do. It's just a right to be included.
Okay. Are there any other comments? Because if they're not, we'll move directly to the next session, slightly ahead of time.